Okay, next we're going to take a look at Plato's Meno, which is a dialogue that will answer some of the questions that came up in Euthyphro and offer solutions to some of the problems that we saw in that text. Themes and topics for this dialogue include the idea of virtue, what virtue is defined as, what it means to be virtuous. We'll see also in this dialogue the famous Meno paradox. We'll see Plato's theory of the eternal soul. We'll see, related to his theory of the eternal soul, his theory of recollection. Again, that's just the idea that you never actually learn anything for the first time, but you're recalling or remembering every piece of knowledge that you have. And lastly, we'll see here also the distinction between knowledge and merely true belief. So we start out here with these two characters, Meno and Socrates, having a conversation about virtue, and specifically where it is that virtue comes from. They identify in the beginning three possibilities, three possible sources for where virtue comes from. They say maybe virtue is taught, maybe virtue is something that's practiced, or maybe virtue is something that is given innately or is natural. So Socrates' first comment on this question, where it is that virtue comes from, is kind of interesting, but probably not surprising based on what you've already seen from him in the Euthyphro dialogue. He says, I have no idea what virtue is, and in fact I've never met anyone who did know what virtue was. And Meno is surprised that Socrates says this. He says, oh, well didn't you just recently meet Gorgias? And a little bit of background on Gorgias is necessary for you to understand why Plato includes this line in this dialogue. He's really implicitly sort of slamming Gorgias and saying that Gorgias didn't really know anything despite his popularity in ancient Greece for a period of time. So Gorgias was a pre-Socratic philosopher. He was someone who was accused of being a sophist, and sophists were people who, at least according to Plato, thought that they could use rhetoric, thought that they could use really crafty public speaking skills in order to convince people of things that weren't necessarily true. The sophists were known for wanting money, they were known for wanting power and other types of influence, and Plato very much kind of looks down upon them throughout numerous texts of his, and we see that going on right here. So when Plato has Meno ask Socrates, oh, you don't know what virtue is, didn't you recently meet Gorgias? This is an implicit sort of comment on Gorgias and how he didn't really know what virtue was. We'll see Gorgias come back into dialogue later on. I do want to give you one famous argument from Gorgias, just to give you an idea of how kind of crazy some of these ideas were that the sophists would sort of spread throughout ancient Greece. Gorgias was known for being an epistemological skeptic. Epistemology is a term that just means science of knowledge. So someone who's an epistemological skeptic thinks you can't really know anything. There's not a lot you can know, or it doesn't really mean a lot to say that you know things. Gorgias is also often called a nihilist, someone who thinks that nothing means anything at all. So his probably most famous argument is his argument that nothing exists. And he says even if something existed, we couldn't know anything about it. And even if we could know something about this thing that exists, we couldn't say anything about it. And even if we could say something about it, no one else would understand what we were saying. So to put this another way, the idea here is kind of like saying how can anyone communicate the idea of something like a color by using language, by using words, if it's true that your ear doesn't hear colors but only hears sounds, right? So he's kind of like saying that we're trapped in our own heads, so we're confined to consciousness, that you can't really know anything about anyone else's experience of reality. So for this reason, we would say that he's also someone we could call a perspectivalist. So again, Meno says, didn't you meet Gorgias? This is an implicit jab at Gorgias and the rest of the sophists. And Socrates actually responds by saying that he doesn't remember what Gorgias told him, and he actually kind of passes the buck to Meno and says, why don't you tell me what Meno thinks, and we can see if your views are reasonable ones. So the first account of virtue that Meno is going to give to Socrates is one that should look kind of familiar to you. Basically, he gives a bunch of examples of virtuous behaviors rather than giving the definition or the essence or the nature or the universal form of virtue, which of course is what Socrates wants. So the problem here that Socrates points out is that Gorgias says that, or sorry, Meno, who kind of implies that he's getting these ideas from Gorgias, he says that virtue is relative, that it depends on who you are. Again, I told you Gorgias was someone who's kind of a perspectivalist, so that's probably not super surprising. But Socrates is going to dismiss this possibility that virtue varies depending on the person in question, right? He wants to know about virtue itself. He doesn't want to know about virtues for specific types of people. For example, a man, a woman, a child, an old person, a free person, a slave. And the reason why he makes this clarification is because Meno tells him, he says, there's virtue for every action and age, for every task of ours, and every one of us. And Socrates, the same goes for wickedness. So the real interesting thing here is this very much is something that kind of resembles early Platonic thinking. This is something that maybe seems like something reflected in the real ideas of Socrates, not Socrates the character in this dialogue, but Socrates the real person who taught Plato during his lifetime. We think that Socrates thought that because you couldn't necessarily pin down forms and essences and universals for things, maybe they didn't exist at all. Maybe all knowledge was relative. Maybe everything was specific and particular. So again, what we're going to see in this dialogue is a step beyond that type of thinking. And Socrates tries to explain what he's looking for in this dialogue when he's looking for an essence or a form or a universal of virtue by using this B example. This is at 72B. He says, there's all sorts of different types of bees. They look different, they have different habits, maybe they eat different types of things. Why do we call them all bees? Why do we group them all together? Well, it's something like their nature, right? It's their essence, it's their form, it's their universal character. Tell me, he says to Meno, what is the very thing in which all of these things are the same and do not differ from one another, right? So this is just a metaphor. He's trying to say that this is the way he wants to approach this question of what virtue is, how to define virtue. He wants something that applies to each and every virtuous act, right? Not just a bunch of examples of virtue, but the definition thereof. So Meno still doesn't really understand what's going on here. And they entertain next this example of health, right? They say, does health differ for a man and for a woman? Does strength differ for a man and for a woman? No, not at all, right? To a certain extent, a doctor may give specific advice for a man or a woman or someone who's older versus someone who's younger. But in general, if we talk about the nature of health, the essence of health, it's one thing. And it's one thing that applies to everybody, right? In any given situation, or at least this is the idea here, right? This is the example. In bioethics, this is considered very suspect and very questionable. So the idea is health has no difference for specific people. The same must surely go for virtue itself. So Meno tries to continue, and he says this time that he's going to give Socrates an answer from Gorgias. He says maybe there's virtuous behaviors, right? So maybe being able to rule over people properly, in other words, maybe being able to be a good king or be a good queen is what is virtue. And he says to Socrates, he says, we could call this justice. Justice is virtue. And Socrates' response is it virtue or is it a virtue? For example, roundness is a shape, but it's not the same as shape itself. And Meno realizes, he means it's just a single virtue. It's a virtue. There must be many others. And of course, that's not what Socrates is looking for. He says we always arrive at the many when what I'm seeking is the one. So Socrates tries to help Meno along with a geometric example. He's going to use the idea of shape to try to show Meno what it is that he means when he talks about form or essence or a universal definition. He says, do you know what a limit or a boundary is? Meno says yes. He says, do you know what a solid is compared to a plane? Meno says yes. And he says, okay, at 76a, shape then is that which limits a solid. So that's basically like an example of a form, right? That's something that's going to apply to any given shape, whether it's something that's circular or spherical, whether it's something that's triangular, whether it's something that is rectangular, right? Any sort of object that has shape is going to have shape in this way, right? Shape as that which limits a solid. We can pin down, in other words, what it is to have shape, right? We can say what it essentially requires, what it must have. So Meno tries to give a new definition based on this analogy that Socrates has given him. And this is kind of a poetic definition of virtue. He says, maybe the definition of virtue is to find joy in beautiful things and to have power. We could reword that. We could say it's desiring what's good and being able to get what's good. Okay? And here's the problem with this. We find that the definition isn't going to work because some people clearly desire things which they think are good, but which other people will disagree with, right? So maybe someone, let's imagine someone wants to conquer the earth or something. He wants to be the ruler of the planet. We wouldn't necessarily say that this person wants to be bad, right? Or this person wants to be evil. This person just has a kind of twisted, different, strange idea of what it is that's good, right? And they give us this line in the dialogue. Plato writes, "Nobody actually wants to be bad." And this is something I always encourage students to think about, the extent to which you agree or disagree with this, right? There's plenty of people throughout history who've done horrible, heinous things, killing, raping, starting wars, right? All sorts of horrible things. But we ask ourselves, right, if Plato's right here, none of these people actually wanted to be bad, right? They just had this weird, different idea, different from the rest of us, about what counted as being good. So it's a really interesting sort of aside here in this dialogue. With all of this, we come to basically the end of the first part of the dialogue, right, where we're inquiring into the nature of virtue. At the end here, Meno is going to try to start breaking virtue up into parts, and we'll find Socrates say that the problem here is the same problem that they ran into when they tried giving examples of virtue, right? You can't, for example, break squareness down into the definition of a corner if you're trying to define squareness, because being a square, right, squareness is more than that. So the form of a square, right, its nature, its essence, isn't just reducible to the idea of a corner. You have to add to it. And we have this line at 79d, where Socrates points out to Meno. He says, "If you remember, when I was answering you about shape, we rejected the kind of answer that tried to answer in terms still being the subject of inquiry and not yet agreed upon." I want to comment really briefly about what this means here. This is kind of a wordy sentence that maybe doesn't make a lot of sense to you. What Socrates is talking about here is basically presupposing exactly what it is that they're supposed to be inquiring into, right? So the idea is, if we give examples of virtue, or we break virtue up into parts, right, we can only say that they're examples. We can only say that they are parts of virtue if we're presupposing some sort of definition of virtue in the first place. And the problem is, they have no idea what that definition is, or at least Meno doesn't. So they're kind of cheating, right? It's kind of like circular reasoning. Again, we saw some of that in Euthyphro. So what happens here in the end of this first part of the dialogue is we run into aporia, right? We're trying to figure out what virtue is. We're trying to figure out what its source is, and we get confused. We don't seem to have made any progress. And what's interesting here is, compared to Euthyphro, you kind of see this aporia depicted a little bit differently. Meno accuses Socrates of putting him under a spell. And I think here that, again, reading implicitly, reading between the lines, what Plato is doing is kind of negatively characterizing Socratic philosophy. This philosophy that said, you know, if you can't find the universal essence of something, if you can't pin down a form, maybe it doesn't exist at all. Plato eventually would come to disagree with that later in his career, and in this text we'll see that in the second part of his dialogue. And this is very much something that I would say exemplifies the transition from Socratic philosophy in Plato's writing, which we saw in Euthyphro, to more proper so-called Platonism in dialogues like the Meno and even the Republic.